Understanding the Trinity, a philosophical approach. Material from this video is largely drawn from an article entitled Transcendentals and Trinity, written by myself and Sister Gloria Schaub of the Department of Theology and Philosophy at Barry University. It was published by the Haythrop Journal in July of 2009 out of the University of London. Now, there are three basic approaches which one can take for trying to understand the Trinity. The first is the biblical approach, using either the Hebrew Scriptures, the Tanakh, or the New Testament. And there are two YouTube videos which go into that subject from this biblical perspective. In the first case, the Tanakh, one is looking for allusions or hints at the nature of God as indicated in the writings of the Old Testament writers. In the New Testament, obviously, where there is the revelation of Jesus, the extent of statements about the nature of God and its divine life is much more extensive. Theological explanations are when scholars take these biblical descriptions and try to put them into some kind of order. And as a result of doing that, attempt to understand more deeply what the significance of these descriptions are. And finally, we have the approach that is mostly taken in this video, the philosophical explanation, although I will be making some comments and some connections with the biblical and the theological as well. Philosophical explanations attempt to use unaided human reason in their process. And what we're going to be doing here is looking back into the history of ideas for insights that may more fully explain or help us to explain the Trinity. First, a disclaimer. All approaches taken together could never contain all that can be known about the Trinity. So one approach, especially the philosophical one, which I'm emphasizing here, is even more limited in what it can contain. The existence and nature of God is something that goes far beyond the human mind's ability to ever wrap itself around it completely. What we're dealing with here ultimately is a mystery. Now, of course, the minute this word comes up, some people are ready to throw up their hands and say, oh, well, why go any further? If it's all a mystery and we can't know anything about it, what's the point? Well, the truth is that when we use this term mystery, we're not saying that nothing can be known about the subject under investigation, but rather that that knowledge will never be exhausted. Now, the same thing is true in the natural order. Science, one might say, is always open-ended. Every time they resolve one question, it seems that it leads to another question, or two or three, that they have to go beyond that. So the term mystery isn't something that should totally put us off. It just helps us to realize that we're never going to completely and fully know what the subject under investigation contains. Now, the first philosopher that we're going to look at is the Athenian philosopher Plato. And you can see by his dates that he lived centuries before the time of Jesus. So he certainly couldn't have been influenced by anything Christian in nature, Christian in thought. And it's highly unlikely that he was even influenced by Jewish thinking on the matter of a single God, for instance, on Hebraic monotheism. It's not impossible, but we don't have any evidence in support of such a claim. Now, Plato was concerned to set human understanding on secure and certain footings. And much of what he uh, wrote about, or thought about, he actually wrote down in a series of dialogues, mostly dialogue forms, that are known exactly by that name, the Dialogues of Plato. They're very interesting and sometimes even entertaining reading. Tells us a lot about certain important historical figures in Greek history. The other notion that almost automatically comes to mind when we mention the name of Plato is what is called his theory of ideas or forms. This is something that is pretty much unique to Plato, certainly to the extent that he developed this particular theory. And the reason that he did that was as a defense against the attacks of the skeptics of his day. Now, these skeptics were people who thought that the material world is such that it is in flux, that it is always changing. And because of the fact that it changes from one thing to another, nothing can ever be known about it. One philosopher maintained, for instance, that you can't put your foot into the same river twice. Why not? Well, the first time that you put it in, it's a dry foot. Then you take it out. The waters of the river have flown down. Now it's a wet foot, so when you're putting it in, it's not the same foot. Now, another skeptic came along and took this position to its really ultimate logical conclusion, and that is that you can't even put your foot into the same river once. Why not? Well, at what point as you are putting your foot into the river is it your foot? When it's totally dry? When the toes get wet? When you have it into your instep, into the water, or all the way into the ankle? And while this is going on, the waters are flowing over the foot. And this is why you can't put your foot into the same river once. And that was the skeptical position. And a lot of people were influenced by that. Well, the problem is that if you can't ever know anything about things because they are always changing, then how can you have any kind of a secure and stable society? That was Plato's problem. And he was also convinced that we do seem to have some concepts that remain constant for human discourse to be able to proceed. And what were these? Well, Plato could look at some of these skeptics and say that on Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays, they were going around teaching students and taking money in order to do so, that nothing can be known about the world. And then they would turn around on Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays and take money to teach these students mathematics. And that is one of the points where Plato, it seems, considered that maybe our understanding of mathematics is going to be the key to understanding the stability of all these other terms, of all these other ideas, which are so critical in the stability of a socio-political institution. Words like justice, words like truth, words like knowledge, words like honor and courage, and on and on and on we can go. Now, where do those things exist? Well, according to Plato, as he thought about this and dialogued about this with many of his contemporaries, concluded that mathematical forms, things like points and lines and arcs, and triangles and circles and squares, that the mathematicians talk about, don't exist in a perfect form in this world in the way that they exist in the minds of mathematicians when they are discussing these things. It seems as if They exist someplace else, in some other dimension, some other reality, some other realm, some other world. And this is why he developed this theory that words like truth and honor and justice and uh, uh, all the other moral forms would exist in that world as well. And so he developed this theory, as I've tried to um, put it in kind of artful way, of where these moral forms existed. Forms like love and piety and beauty, justice, courage, virtue, and so on. Now, I admit that I have the moral forms embedded in the mathematical forms, and this is not something that Plato did, and I wouldn't want to give that impression. Rather, it's that they were seen, first of all, in the dialogues as separate from one another. Many of the dialogues are short in length, and they try primarily to define one or another of these terms. Plato felt that until the disputants in any kind of an argument or a discussion where they were trying to arrive at some kind of common consensus didn't have their terms clearly defined, it was very easy for them to just simply be talking past one another. And this is why he spends as much time as he does trying to define a variety of what he thought were extremely consequential terms of his day. But Plato tells us a few other things about these forms, and that is that they are pure, that they are perfect, that they're pristine. So, for instance, as an example, a circle can never be confused with a square, and a square can never be confused with a triangle. Each of these are what they are fully and completely in themselves. They are permanent. They are eternal. And what we have down here in the world are instances that imitate these eternal forms. But a problem arose for Plato where the moral forms were concerned. While there's no problem with circles and squares and triangles, there is a bit of a problem with statements or realities such as being and unity, oneness, truth, goodness, justice, etc. For instance, you can't say that a circle is a triangle. But what about something like justice? Is justice good? Or is being one? Is it a unity? Now it seems as if what you're doing is conflating these ideas. You're melding them together. And as such, then, they wouldn't be pure in and of themselves, but mixed in some way. And this was very disconcerting to Plato and other people who promoted this world of forms theory. It was an argument that could be used by his opponents in order to say, hey, your theory is really lacking in some things here and therefore not all that very convincing. Well, it is thanks to Plato's very brilliant student, Aristotle, that at least some of this difficulty was resolved. Aristotle, while he was not an Athenian, came to the academy, which was a school that Plato had actually set up in Athens for the instruction of would-be savants to come there and learn. And Aristotle came at the age of about 19, from what we know, and was a student of Plato for quite a couple of decades almost, before, as a result of the politics of the school, which we won't get into, he eventually left, went off back to Macedonia, where he came from, tutored the then young Alexander, who was later to become Alexander the Great, for a few years. And then when Alexander succeeded to the kingship of Macedonia, Aristotle returned back to Athens with the support of Alexander to found his own school there, which became known as the Lyceum. And the two of these vied for the allegiance and subscription of the Athenians and other scholars throughout the Hellenic world at the time. Now, one of the problems that Aristotle had to contend with Plato's theory of knowledge, was the view that for Plato, all knowledge, as he puts it in a dialogue called the Meno, all knowledge is remembering. And this was the way that he tried to resolve the problem with the skeptics. The skeptics would simply ask the question, how do you know when you have arrived at what you think is a truth, that it really is the truth? How do you know that you haven't made a mistake? Well, Plato's answer to that was that what happens when we, quote, discover a truth is that we're really remembering something that we knew in a past life. And so this new discovery is simply a reflection of that, and we say, aha, that's the reason why it's true, why I know it's true, because it fits in with what I had known to be true before. And I guess a lot of people, certainly Meno in the dialogue, kind of says, well, of course, obviously, no problem here. But Aristotle wasn't willing to accept such a simple and facile answer here. He recognized that if you accept this theory, you still have a problem. And that is, how did you know in this past life that it was true? Oops. And I have to say, oh, well, you knew it in a life before that, and a life before, well, you can see what happens here. You go through an unending succession of past lives where you knew something was the truth. For Aristotle, the question is, well, how did you first come to know this? And Aristotle gives an answer to that, and at the same time ends up dismissing the need for any kind of a past life to serve as the basis for your assurance that what you have come to know or to discover is true. According to Aristotle's formation of ideas, all knowledge begins with sensation. It isn't something that is already pre-programmed in the mind as a result of past experiences. The mind is pretty much a blank slate. It does have certain powers, certain capacities, certain capabilities in its raw state. But what it needs in order to put it into its own proper activity is going to be the information which it gets over a period of time through the senses. And all we have to do is observe a small child, a baby, as it starts going through the process of experiencing things and recognizing them, and especially when it starts learning language and when it starts appending words to certain kinds of objects, but not to others. So, we begin with sensation. But ideas, these concepts that Plato said were in some realm of reality apart from the physical world, these, according to Aristotle, are abstracted by the human mind from the data of sensation. So some of these notions, such as goodness or truth or justice, we eventually create in our minds or bring about in our minds as a result of observing either the kinds of objects which are named by that term or the sorts of behaviors which properly fit under these kinds of terms or others. For Aristotle, the human mind, human intellect, is primarily made to know the essence or nature of material objects. I'm going to repeat that. Made to know the essence or nature of material objects. It wouldn't be able to discourse linguistically if behind every noun word there wasn't some sort of a concept which a person understood is proper to that kind of a thing. And the reason why the human mind is made to know primarily these essences or natures of material things is that because we function in a material world. if we are going to survive, much less thrive, we have to know certain things about the characteristics and properties of the objects that we encounter and that we deal with. However, simply because that is where our first and most proper focus is oriented, does not mean that the human mind is unopen to the idea of knowing being as such, to knowing things of a greater extension, or have characteristics or qualities that are above and beyond those that it encounters in the material world. In fact, Aristotle postulated some things about the area of existence in what he called here, I can clear the screen, what he called his hierarchy of being. And it appears as if um, the fonts here are a little short, a little small. So let me describe it. At the very bottom of this hierarchy of being, right over here, he has something which he calls prime matter. And I'm not going to get into that in cosmology. Let's get up a little higher about things that we're more familiar with. We've got objects that are purely material, like this remote. It's made of plastic. It doesn't have any life force in it. It doesn't sense anything. It doesn't grow. It's a non-living thing. Then we get here into the area of living things, such as plants. Obviously, the level of life of a plant is much more basic, much less evolved, much less complex than would be the case with insects or non-mammals. And then finally we get up here into the area of mammals, those things that we tend to have a lot more enjoyment in dealing with than, say, for instance, things like insects and so on. And then, of course, over here we have rational animals. And guess what realm of reality fits in there? Well, that's us, according to Aristotle. We are rational animals. That is, we are able to think in a universal fashion. This is why we have history. This is why we have science. This is why we have mathematics. This is why we have philosophy, because we're able to do those things. Other animal forms, even those that are capable of surprisingly interesting forms of endeavors, don't have the ability to function at the same high level as do human beings. Now, there's something else that Aristotle had, and to what degree he took this from Plato is uncertain. But for Aristotle, if you look at the hierarchy of being, all of these are a combination of activity and potentiality. That is, they can grow or they can evolve, they can mature. They're not stuck at some level when they first come into existence from which they can go no higher. So this is the case over here with all living things. Now, if this is true about rational animals, we have this ability to engage in intellectual pursuits. And at the highest level, we have something which Aristotle called a pure act, something that is fully and completely, supremely in activity. It doesn't have a possibility for any further evolution to a higher state uh, or to a higher ability. Um, that's at the very height. Well, in between these two, of rational animal and pure act, he postulated the existence of levels of things that he called disembodied intellects. These are minds that are capable of knowing things in a way far superior to anything that human beings can do. And ultimately, you arrive at this pure act, which Aristotle, as we will also see, calls a self-thinking thought. But that's for a little later. Now, going back to the human condition, if we look at human beings, we find that they can have or not have certain qualities or characteristics or properties or abilities and so on. And I've just put a few up here in the diagram. So, for instance, some people might be scientifically oriented, and others, they don't care about that very much. Or they're very good at mathematics, and a lot of other people can very well do without that particular subject. Some people are athletic, so much so that they can make a living and earn quite a substantial amount of income from their abilities. You have other people who are musical or artistic or whatever might be the case. And these can come and go in an individual. Some people, for instance, are very good with languages. They might learn a language. They may be quite competent at it for a number of years. And then as a result of not using it over time, um, they lose their capacity to employ it fluently. These are what we call natural properties. They express an attribute not necessarily expressed by the original concept of being or essence. So, for instance, the fact that someone is a rational animal, which is the being or essence of a human being, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be artistic or that they're going to be athletic, have a high level of athletic ability, or any of the other characteristics or properties that you might find in other human beings. Still, for all that, whatever attribute they have, it is something that is real. It has to be in order for them to function out of that attribute or that property. And that attribute flows from the essence of the kind of things they are. You don't have, for instance, dogs that are mathematical. You don't have cats that are musical, that can engage in musical activity, and so on. But a property or attribute, that is a natural property or attribute, is distinct from what was first known or encountered. In order to know whether that attribute or property actually exists in the thing, you have to see the actions or behaviors that would flow properly from that person having that attribute or characteristic. Now, what about that problem that Plato had with these very abstract forms melding into one another? Is justice good? Is the truth something that is worth having? Is being one, for instance? This is one of the questions that he discusses with Parmenides. Is being a unity? And the problem was, well, if being is a unity, then it seems as if what we have here is not one thing, but two things. We've got being and we've got a unity. The way that Aristotle helps to resolve this is by noting that what we're really talking about here aren't natural properties. That's why I went through that whole discourse on natural properties. It's not natural properties here. We shouldn't be giving it that word. If we're thinking that way, we're thinking wrongly. Uh, what we have here, according to Aristotle, are transcendental properties. These objects, and the three that we're going to be looking at, being, truth, and goodness, are transcendental properties. And as such, what they do is that they express something whose extensions are equal to the other properties associated with it. They are coextensive. Now that seems to be a mouthful, so let me kind of explain that. Well, first of all, to note this. These transcendental properties necessarily flow from being as being. Now, notice that this was not the case with natural properties. They didn't naturally flow. Some might be there, some might not. But in the case of the transcendental properties, they are going to be there. They're going to be there totally, as we're going to say, because they flow from the thing's being, from its very existence, the fact that it exists. It's got to have these other properties, these transcendental properties. As such, they're only logically distinct. They're a distinction which the mind makes, but it has to be careful not to separate them, as, for instance, you can do with the natural properties. So they're only logically distinct. And while they add something to our fuller understanding of being, they add nothing to the being itself. The being already encompasses these things fully and completely. So let's start off here with this first term, being. And this is because this was, for Aristotle, the primary notion that a philosopher should be working under. And this was not the case with Plato. Plato was more interested in essences and natures than he was with being. In fact, if one looks at the dialogues that he indexed in the back of the dialogues, you find that under the term being, you only have about a half column of references, whereas something like goodness or beauty or truth, you have multiple columns, one and a half, two, even more than that. So being was not the primary notion for Plato, but it was for Aristotle. And this is true all the way down through philosophers from his time, through the medievals like St. Thomas Aquinas, reaching all the way to contemporary thinkers such as Bernard Lonergan in his book entitled Insight, where being is the term under which all other reality is subsumed, under which all other reality is categorized. It's the ultimate concept. There is no other concept that is greater than being, in which being is included as one of its parts. Now, the next thing that Aristotle notes, by the way, a lot of material here from Irving's book, Aristotle, First Principles. The other thing that Aristotle notes is that by its very nature, to the degree that it possesses being, up that scale of being, the more knowable it is in itself. And that knowability is something that we call truth. When a human mind appropriates the reality which it is experiencing in a way that is correct, in a way that is as full as the human mind is capable of acquiring it, then we would say that that person is in the possession of truth. And all that can be known about that object is going to be commensurate with the reality of that object's existence. If you try to impose more onto something than what it actually contains, then what you've done is falsified it. You're no longer in the area of truth. You've kind of gone beyond its limits. So truth we can define as the knowability of being, that the, for another intellect to encounter that object and to come to possess at least some of what that object contains means that what it has in that act of knowledge is an instance of truth about that object. But Aristotle goes on further here, besides being and truth. Let's keep these two notions clear in our minds, because this is what we're dealing with. The third of these is goodness, or the good of a thing. To the degree that something exists on the scale, on that hierarchy of being, the higher up it goes in being, the higher also is its potential for goodness. That is why human beings are capable of doing certain kinds of things which other mammal-like forms in reality cannot. And where is it that we find most of our good in life? Hopefully, it's through our interaction with other human beings, and not at their expense, seeking to find good in something that is lower or lesser on the scale of being. So here we have these three notions of being, truth, and goodness. Now, as far as goodness is concerned, this one right here, we can go back to Plato for a moment, because Plato has a kind of interesting statement about the good. And he says this: the good diffuses of itself. And what he meant by that was that the very nature of good is to share, to extend itself, to want others to have at least some of what it actually has as well. And so here we can say that in that act of sharing, what we have really is an act of love, because love is willing or wishing the goodness of things onto someone else. Sometimes we try to make it ourselves in a human relationship, or have others give us their goodness by the degree to which they share themselves with us. Now, going back to something that was said earlier, these three notions of being, truth, and goodness are commensurate with each other. Where you find one, to that same degree you will find the other. And so what they end up doing is merging, at least I can try to visualize it here, as we bring them together into a single whole of being, truth, and love. And so I'm going to reiterate here something that was said before about these transcendental properties, that they express something whose extensions are equal to the other properties associated with it. They are co-extensive. Now, let us see how we can appropriate these transcendental qualities to the persons of the Blessed Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. If we look at the first transcendental, we realize that being is the one that is most appropriable to the Father, And that is evident from the fact that where being is not, neither then are any of the other transcendental qualities that follow on it. And to the degree that being is not, the transcendental qualities are diminished accordingly. Now, this term Father, which is used quite frequently by Jesus, also has instances in the Tanakh where it is used about the God which speaks to Moses. We have it in Deuteronomy. And it is in some of the other prophets, such as Isaiah and Jeremiah, where the God of the Hebrews is referred to as Father. It's not often, but it is done. Now, how does God himself define or describe himself when Moses asks him, who shall I say the children of who shall I say to the children of Israel that it was who sent me? And the burning bush replies, I am who am, the first person of the verb to be, from which we get the participle being. We talk about the supreme being. So this is why the notion of being is most properly applied to the Father, or in Christian terminology, the first person of the Blessed Trinity. Now, what about truth? What is present to itself is the knowledge that God has of himself. The truth that the divine intellect has of itself is so complete and so perfect as to virtually duplicate itself in an existent as well. In Augustine's model, for instance, great theologian St. Augustine, thought is distinct from God's self, being, and therefore engenders an image which is living, subsistent, and interior, an image of God in spirit and truth. Truth, then, is most fittingly attributable to the Son. John's Gospel, the prologue of it, goes into some detail on that. And Jesus himself describes who he is as the way, the truth, and the life. And so often, before Jesus says things, he so often will preface it by saying, Amen, amen, I say to you in truth. And so this is why we appropriate truth to the second person of the Blessed Trinity, to Jesus. And that leaves us then with goodness and love, hence to the Holy Spirit. Goodness is what follows on the awareness, good and what follows on the awareness of good, which the good diffusing itself, which is love, is most properly and fittingly attributed to the third person of the Trinity. It is out of the knowledge that the Father has of the Son that the love between them is spirated into the Holy Spirit. Unlike human knowledge and love, even knowledge and love of oneself, which is always imperfect, always less as intellectual phenomena than the respective objects of that love. The divine forms of these activities are so perfect and so complete as to engender what the theologians call a hypostasis, that is, a reality that is fully and completely equal to that from which it comes, from which it originates. Now we can see something of the Trinity in human beings. After all, it does say in Genesis, let us make man in our image and likeness. Well, if you consider the way a human being comes into the world and develops and evolves, it starts off pretty much as a body with a lot of capacities and capabilities that over time evolve. And we become not only realities that exist in the physical world, but we have a complete mental and will-like existence. We are attracted by truth and by the goodness of things. To the degree that one or another of these three elements suffers from some kind of debilitation, it affects the other two. And this is especially the case in something where a person loses their intellectual capacities due to illness or accident or whatever the case. Or people who become depressed and despondent, who can never see something worthwhile that motivates them in life. They become withdrawn, and the quality of their life is reduced accordingly. So here we have an image of the Trinity at work in the human condition itself. Well, it's my hope that this short video has been instructive, and if those of you who would like to read the entire article that was published in the Haythrop Journal, if you would send an email to my email address at ccassini@barry.edu, I will very happily send you a copy of the article. For those of you wishing to do more research on the matter, I am hereby making available the material and sources from which the article was drawn. Thank you for watching for this video. Goodbye for now.